This is going to be the fourth panel. Please, can we take our seats? Show good civility. Great, everyone's had some refreshments, fed, fueled, ready for action. Great. So this panel is entitled Nuclear Weapons versus Nuclear Arms Control and Disarmament. Obviously, there's a relation, between those two elements. And maybe it's my gray hair, but I have the recollection, indeed the memory, that 25 years ago, there was a review conference of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. 191 states parties, most widely supported, you might say, arms control, non-proliferation, disarmament, multilateral accord. And at the review conference, there was a consensus document, an outcome document adopted. And it had an element, a section, and became entitled the 13 Practical Steps. And these were 13 practical measures that all the state parties swore that they would uphold going forward. And one of them, I would underscore, relevant to this panel, was that all the states parties at NPT pledged to reduce the saliency of nuclear weapons in their security policies and doctrines. Well, I think that's a pledge that has not exactly been honored with observance in the 25 years subsequently. And that sets some of the challenges that we face as an international community in considering this most destructive of weapons of mass destruction. So we have two eminent commentators, experts on this subject matter before us. Both, I would note, also members of the Canadian Pugwash group, happy to bring their expertise to bear in this public-facing conference. On my right, we have Matt Korda, who's been involved with the Federation of American Scientists, a very prominent NGO based in Washington, D.C., and some of you may already be familiar with the nuclear notebooks that are maintained by FAS, and Matt is one of the key producers of those authoritative accounts of countries possessing nuclear weapons. And on my left, Cesar Jaramillo, who opened up our conference this morning in his usual eloquent and passionate commentary on the state of the world. He is steeped in following matters relating to nuclear weapons and nuclear deterrence, and in some ways all the elements to where they figure into our security policies. So without further ado, I would ask Matt to lead us off with his presentation. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you so much, Paul. Thank you so much for having me. I've got the honor of doing the immediate post-lunch presentation slot. So I brought some slides. We'll try and wake everyone up. But thank you so much for having me here. So as Paul mentioned, my name is Matt. I work at the Federation of American Scientists, one of the oldest nuclear policy organizations on the planet. We were founded by members of the Manhattan Project who subsequently realized that, in fact, science should be used for the benefit of humanity rather than to its detriment. And so the major research output that we produce is to try and put together the best non-classified estimates of global nuclear forces and trends. The way that we do that is using tools like satellite imagery, Freedom of Information Act requests, budgetary documents, treaty information, watching military parades, really anything that we can sort of get our hands on. We've been doing this work at FAS for more than 3 decades, and so generally speaking, as one of the more authoritative sources in this space, If you've seen, newspaper articles, things like that, that quote a certain number of nuclear weapons attributed to a particular country, generally that number tends to come from us. So that's just a bit of an introduction for what we do. Now, there are some aspects of nuclear information that need to be kept secret, right? How to build one, perhaps the security measures that are used to protect them. But really, from our perspective, that's almost it, right? There is a lot more nuclear information that is out there that remains classified, not because it needs to be kept classified, but because generally speaking, it is done to silence domestic debate, to shield policymakers and journalists and folks like yourselves from understanding the true scope of the nuclear threat, and to keep things like budgets secret. And so what we try and do is pull back the curtain for people and make sure that folks like yourselves have access to the best information possible. So that's really why I'm here today. This type of work is, I think, getting more important because as nuclear threats continue to rise, nuclear opacity is rising with it. Countries are getting a lot more secretive about their nuclear arsenals, and we're going to talk about that in a second. So I'm going to focus my remarks on sort of this new nuclear age in which we find ourselves. Maybe it's not new, we can talk about that. Maybe it's more like renewed. But since I only have 10 to 15 minutes, I'll speak a little generally, and then we can hopefully get into some more substance in the Q&A. So the new nuclear age, I guess I would suggest, is characterized by two different types of instability, right? Arms race instability and crisis instability. And what do I mean by that? The former is driving nuclear armed states to build up their arsenals, and the latter is making nuclear use more likely when tensions are high. And so these two types of instability, they're not new, right? They've existed throughout the entirety of the nuclear age, throughout the Cold War. But these are really, I would suggest, are at their highest points since the end of the Cold War, and understanding why that is might help us, understand how to reduce the risks that are associated with them. So first, talking about arms race instability and thinking a little bit about these countries that you can see here. I know, actually, maybe it's visible. The United States and Russia have about 90% of all of the nuclear weapons in the world. That percentage, though, is shrinking. Right? And it's not because the US and Russia are disarming, right? Far from it. I think we all know that. It's because other countries are building up. And so they constitute now a larger portion of this overall nuclear inventory pie, I suppose. Just to highlight a few countries in particular, we often hear about China. They are certainly expanding, right? They're undergoing one of the largest nuclear expansions that they've ever taken since they first developed nuclear weapons. The UK, right? The UK used to be a country that was sort of a paragon of transparency and disarmament. Not so much anymore, right? The UK has become increasingly opaque. In recent years, they've announced a total 180 on their disarmament policy, and now they're starting to increase once again. We have India and Pakistan who are slowly increasing. We have North Korea, right? So this is kind of happening all across the board. An important takeaway here is that these dynamics, right, these modernization programs are going to keep nuclear weapons in global nuclear arsenals for the next 50 to 70 years, right? That's sort of these long timelines that we're talking about. And we can talk a little bit more about that as well, about how the pace of disarmament and these incredibly long procurement timelines make things a lot more difficult for us to sort of push back against. We're also no longer in the days of the Cold War, right? When it was just two superpowers, pointing missiles at one another. There are 9 nuclear armed countries today. They hold very complex, intertwining deterrence relationships with one another, right? You can think about, China, which is worried about US action in the Pacific. It also has a simmering border conflict with India, right? India certainly has its tensions with Pakistan. Pakistan, I think it was back in 2024, the Biden administration slapped a bunch of sanctions on Pakistan because they said they were developing a missile capable of reaching the United States. So you can sort of see how there's like a big, I don't know what the right word is here, but there's a domino effect, right? And so we have a situation in which actions that one country takes can have this sort of ripple-like effect on 3, 4, 5 other countries as well. These developments, I think, are made more concerning by the fact that states are becoming a lot more opaque about their nuclear weapons. I mentioned this before, right? So we have countries like the US and the UK. These are countries that previously were very, very transparent, much less so, right? So we had in the UK specifically in 2021, they announced that they would no longer give any information about the number of warheads that they have in their stockpile, the number of warheads that they deploy on their ships, on their submarines. This was largely done to pretty much coincide with what the first Trump administration wanted. And similarly, right, you can see in this document that's on the top right there, we've had instances of documents in which we've noticed nuclear-related changes, and then we've reported on them, and then the documents have been scrubbed by the United States. So on the top right there, we broke this story a couple of years ago that the United States was planning on returning nuclear weapons to the United Kingdom, to UK soil. They had been withdrawn 15 years previously. And so we reported on that. We noticed in this budget document, you could see it says the UK right there. I kind of circled it in this like red. And then in the next year's budget, all the country names are gone, right? So they're paying attention to what we report on, but it's interesting that the impulse from the US is, and honestly, for most nuclear armed governments, is that they're going to sort of fall back on this secrecy. In addition, right, we have New START, right, the last bilateral strategic nuclear arms control treaty. This was a really useful way for us to get information about nuclear weapons, right, what is being deployed. The US and Russia are no longer complying with those parts of the treaty. Russia said it suspended its agreement, and the US took what it calls reciprocal countermeasures. In practice, what this means is that no one is complying with the treaty. And so we're not able to get access to that information anymore. In addition, we have things like budgets being classified. The B-21 bomber, which is like going to be a massive new heavy bomber replacement in the US, that whole budget is classified, right? We don't even know how much it costs. This is crazy, right? Like this is clearly meant to suppress public debate. There's no national security impetus for classifying an entire program budget. Another factor that's driving this, and this is something I think has been talked about a lot today and is a real theme, is sort of offense-defense dynamics, right? So, and what that sort of generates is when you have countries that are building up their missile defenses, this tends to spur other countries to want to build weapons that are designed to circumvent those missile defenses, right? So this happened in 2018, right, when Russia, I think Putin unveiled these like big new weapon systems. They were called exotic by the media because they were honestly pretty weird. It was like a nuclear-powered cruise missile and a nuclear torpedo and all these things. But in his speech, Putin said, all of these weapon systems are specifically designed to circumvent US missile defenses, right? So you sort of get this action-reaction dynamic that is predictable. With Golden Dome, this is obviously going to get a lot worse. The ironic thing is that missile defense systems don't even really have to work that well in order to generate this dynamic. They just have to exist, and another country has to believe in either their current capability or a future capability that they could eventually be upgraded to the point where they would work as designed. Industry influences, just for the sake of time, I'm going to breeze right past this. I think everyone here knows what I'm talking about. But they also, these industry influences exacerbate things that we see in terms of mirror imaging, right? So you often have countries that are building capabilities, not because it's involved in their, it's sort of a part of their strategic requirements or part of a certain doctrine, but it's because they see other countries doing it and there's a domestic hype around it, right? Hypersonic weapons are a major, they fall into that category, I think, very well. And these new programs are able to be pursued because we don't really have arms control anymore. This is going to be a significant challenge because both the US and Russia have meticulously planned their nuclear forces with the assumption that neither country is going to breach the New START central limit caps. If that assumption goes away, then force planning goes out the way, right? And we're going to see the US and Russia start to increase and upload more weapons onto their existing deployed missile systems. That's something that they could do roughly within a year or two, right? Depending on what sort of weapon system you have, you could essentially upload hundreds of new warheads into the bomber forces within a couple days. ICBMs and submarines take a little bit longer. You have to wait until they come back to port. In Russia, the ICBMs are really spread out, so they are as well in the United States. And so these things take time. But I've heard from, just anecdotally, from folks in the United States that their expectation is that they could execute a complete upload of their entire strategic forces, meaning adding hundreds and hundreds of new warheads onto existing deployed forces within a year or two. And that is the plan, right? There are many people within the US government right now who want that to happen. I think the big question is it going to? And they're sort of, I think, using it both as a bargaining chip and also it would be costly and complicated. But there are people advocating for that. So that's kind of where I see maybe a next step in the U.S. force posture. I guess a challenging thing here, and this kind of brings me to this point about crisis instability, is that a rush to rebuild, right, a rush to upload more warheads onto ICBMs, bombers, submarines, that is visible, right? That is a visible thing that can happen. You can see it from space. I could see it. You could all see it if you went on Google Earth. Like states can certainly watch it. And so when you have suddenly a lot of trucks in Russia or the United States moving warheads out into certain areas, certain parts of the country, people are going to notice that, right? And so perhaps you get into a situation in which when tensions are high, there's a rush to preemption to make sure that you're, uploading faster than the other country can upload, right? So you get into kind of a situation there. This brings me to crisis instability, and I'll just speed along here because I know we want to get to the Q&A as well, and to Cesar's presentation. So crisis instability makes nuclear use more likely when tensions are high. You can look at India and Pakistan as a representative example, right? These are countries that have a lot of tension with each other. They have border complications and skirmishes on a somewhat regular basis. But what we're seeing in both countries is that there's an incentive to shrink launch windows as much as possible, right? So that nuclear use can take place at the outset of a conflict, right when something is about to happen. And so, for example, India has superior conventional forces over that of Pakistan. And so Pakistan's posture, and they openly say this, is we have tactical nuclear weapons and we'll use them on day one of a conflict if we see something happening, right? So there is this sort of push to try and launch really quickly if there is a tension. In addition, nuclear and non-nuclear entanglement. What do I mean by this? This is the phenomenon that is increasingly happening kind of across multiple nuclear armed states, in which they are sort of entangling both their civilian and nuclear capabilities, as well as their nuclear and non-nuclear capabilities. So for example, communication satellites, right? These are things that, they're useful for civilian purposes. They're useful for warfighting in a conventional, non-nuclear way. They're also critical for nuclear command and control. Some countries try and separate these things to add a little bit of clarity. Other countries don't separate them at all. And so, if you're in a conflict situation and a communication satellite goes down, how is a country supposed to interpret, is this because someone is about to do a preemptive strike on me? Is this a prelude to a nuclear attack? Is it an accident? It's complicated. I put an image of a missile here. This is a Chinese DF-26. What's particularly interesting about this missile is that you can see it has this sort of clamshell covering that opens up that's attached to the launcher itself. Why is that unique? It's because it allows missile crews to essentially walk up and swap warheads on the ground, right before launching. This is a very unique capability, right? And so what that allows you to do is take a conventional missile and turn it into a nuclear one, or a nuclear one and turn it into a conventional one pretty quickly on the ground right before launch, right? So it just exacerbates these tensions where countries don't really know what's coming. And then I guess one of my last points here is, when it comes to nuclear stability, right, we've tended to assume that, leaders are going to act rationally in the context of a crisis. I don't know. Need I say more? Like this is not a group of people that I think most rational people would trust with nuclear weapons. There's more I could add to this list, certainly. But I think what's also important to mention, and this sort of came up on the roundtable yesterday too, is that we're now a real feature of this nuclear age that we're in now is that nuclear weapons are sort of tied in very closely with the rise of authoritarianism. And there are certain unique traits that exist in the context of authoritarian individuals and the information systems that underpin them. And when you sort of cross that with nuclear weapons, you get potentially some pretty different and dangerous situations in which you have leaders who essentially have to get every nuclear decision right? Which is, already a tall order. But then add in, sort of a sycophantic yes men type of information environment that surrounds them, as well as like their own personal narcissism, and you end up with kind of a dangerous situation. And all these challenges would be easier to manage if countries had the means or the ability to talk to each other as often as they should during crises. But that actually does not happen very often, right? Not all countries with nuclear weapons are linked up. Actually, only a very small number. The P5 are not. And so really when in an age when nuclear crises would inevitably involve lots of different countries, not just two, there are really no multilateral hotlines in the context of nuclear crisis. And so that's something that needs a quick fix. And so I think I'll leave it there for now so that we can hear from Cesar and then go into Q&A, but I really look forward to engaging with you all. Thanks so much.
Yes. No, thanks, Matt. That's a great setup for all to consider. And I'll ask Cesar now to follow up with his comments. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Paul, and thank you very much, Matt. I always learn so much from Matt's presentations. Very cool. So, yeah, a few words about the nuclear weapons versus nuclear disarmament. I think, first of all, that the title for the panel is quite apt, including the versus. And I think in that equation, nuclear weapons are winning and not the nuclear disarmament part of the equation. And this, I should say, came up yesterday during a roundtable that some of us held on specifically on the urgency of nuclear disarmament. The notion, the troubling, sad notion that arms control is losing. On trying to rid the world of nuclear weapons, we are losing. We are on the losing camp. The camp that wants to perpetuate nuclear weapons, the camp that is modernizing nuclear weapons, the camp that is coming up with justifications for the indefinite retention of nuclear weapons, that is the camp that we are winning. So we are in the losing camp. Losers, but anyway.
Virtuous.
But I'm also speaking of titles, not just the title of this session, nuclear weapons versus nuclear disarmament, but also the title of this whole day, which of course has Trump in the title. I think it's Canada's or Canadian security interests in the era of Trump or in the time of Trump or something to that effect. And just one clarification that, and this came up a little bit with David and with Peggy in the last panel, is that it's quite comforting and easy to blame Trump for anything, many of the things that are wrong today that we're lamenting today, including related to nuclear disarmament, including related to strategic stability, including related to what we may consider to be detrimental U.S. Foreign policy. But the reality is not quite as Trump-focused as it is, even if we all agree, or most of us would agree, about his erratic personality and bombastic, and the rapidity with which we are seeing this dismantling of many assumptions and institutions, etc. And some manifestations of the Trump presidency may be more Canadian specific. The fentanyl matter, the steel, the softwood lumber, those are very Canadian specific. But on big ticket foreign policy issues, it's not like Biden was particularly better, and so I think that needs to be. I'm not here to defend Trump in any way, shape, or form, but only but really a reality check. I mean, and not just nuclear files. If you look at selling weapons to unscrupulous regimes, including Saudi Arabia, is Trump equally as Biden? If you think of unconditional support for the state of Israel, even if he's committing war crimes, it's exactly the same Trump as it is Biden. If you think about this buildup of a possible confrontation down the line with China, it was building up with Trump and with Biden. If you look at the modernization of nuclear arsenals, it is virtually the same with Trump and with Biden. And if you look at the obstinate positions of the United States when it goes to conferences such as those of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, it is equally obstinate with Trump as it was with Biden, at least as far as I remember from the conferences I've attended. So once again, this is not to excuse Trump, and I fully realize, and I've myself criticized quite a bit of Trump's policies, including the details. But once again, on the nuclear file, not to mention other big-ticket items, it it is less of an aberration than a form of continuity, of extreme continuity, of intense continuity, and of troubling continuity, but still there is an element of continuity without minimizing, the Trump-specific, just many despicable qualities. But there is a level of continuity there. So that's one key point for the context. And the second point, and some of you may have heard this already yesterday from the roundtable or even at the Senate the other day, is that when we speak of nuclear disarmament, the short answer from my perspective is there is none to be observed. There is no nuclear disarmament. So nuclear disarmament as a path, as a roadmap, as a project with a somewhat identifiable end game, etc., does not exist. There is nothing. It exists in our minds. It exists in some documents. It exists in some policy papers, but in nothing observable in reality that you could say, oh, nuclear disarmament is happening, imperfect as it may be, but we'll get there. No, there isn't. But it's not neutral either. We're moving away from nuclear disarmament, including because of measures such as the ones that Matt mentioned in the United States, but across the board in every single nuclear armed state. And I said yesterday to some of you that I believe we are closer today to one more nuclear weapon state than to one fewer nuclear weapon state. We're closer today to a nuclear catastrophe intended by intention, accident, or design than to nuclear elimination. And that's a problematic situation to be in. Next year, we have the 5-yearly review conference of the Treaty on the Non-Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, and it's make or break, consequential, however you want to call it, but it's really, I think, from many observers, it's going to be a consequential meeting. So in the time that I have left, I want to briefly point to 7 issues for those folks who might be paying attention. Okay, what will be the fault lines? What may be the fault lines at the NPT review conference? 7 issues that are going to be relevant for the government of Canada, are going to be relevant for civil society people following the proceedings, for states in nuclear alliances, and certainly for nuclear armed states. And some of these will be familiar to most or all of you. And I'll be brief. There's lots to be said about each, but just these issues. So the first is the question of nuclear sharing. And the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty has specific articles against the transfer of nuclear weapons, against receiving nuclear weapons. Yet, at the same time, as many of you will know, there are NATO nuclear weapons, specifically U.S.-owned nuclear weapons in the territories of five European states that are officially non-nuclear weapon states. So that's Turkey, Italy, Belgium, Netherlands, and Germany. So this is problematic, and you've probably heard of the ritualistic nature of the NPT meetings, whereby the vast majority of the international community criticizes this practice as being incompatible with the ultimate goal of nuclear disarmament, and then states that participate in these practices or their allies, such as Canada, such as NATO members, defend the practices and reject any efforts to abandon them. This was complicated recently because Russia put nuclear weapons of their own in Belarus. So now even what little moral sort of defense NATO would have about that, their own stationing of weapons, their territory. I mean, they cannot criticize as much as I'm sure they would like to the placement of Russian nuclear weapons in Belarus as destabilizing, as a grave threat to international security, etc., which it is destabilizing because they are doing exactly the same thing. So this is likely to come up again with slim chances of resolution. Second, the question of modernization of nuclear arsenals. I mean, it's really one of those issues that even if everything else were to align, we are investing in prolonging the lives by decades of the nuclear deterrent. And these investments are happening across the board in every single country, and they are problematic because, by definition, they push the goal of nuclear disarmament further down the road. And these are not problematic just in themselves because of the impact of these investments in the U.S. alone. You know, some estimates are more than $2 trillion in a once-in-a-generation overhaul. China is set to as much as duplicate its nuclear arsenal in the coming decade. So these are problematic because of the impact on security and stability and the lifespan of nuclear weapons, but also I personally find them offensive because of the opportunity cost. You're spending trillions of dollars in upgrading nuclear weapons while paying lip service to the goal of nuclear disarmament and while knowing that there are so many unmet needs in the world today. So that's another. The third is benchmarks. The international community is pleading, begging, insisting that the obvious way to track progress on nuclear disarmament is to have something to compare with, and there is resistance to having any form of benchmarks, targets, timelines, anything verifiable, anything measurable. So what you're left with at successive meetings of the NPT is taking their word for it. You know, there's no real verifiability, there's no consistent reporting, and there most definitely are no benchmarks. Now, if you go to these meetings, there are efforts in the initial drafts of the document to have some semblance of targets, benchmarks embedded in them so that there is some room for comparison. But the nuclear weapon states and their allies, they soften the draft, literally. The wording is changed so that there is no specificity and it is left to vague commitments that are impossible to prove one way or another, and they just claim progress at the next meeting. The next issue is the Middle East, and that's a thorny one. But let me just say that this is a tragedy, I think, in the Iran issue, that we still have not managed to solve this diplomatically. I was telling Matt yesterday, I was, some of you know, I was in Tehran a couple of months ago in Iran and a meeting with Iranian officials on the nuclear file. And when you're in Tehran, or I was sort of alert, like, okay, I don't want to be a propaganda vehicle or a mouthpiece. I want like a proper assessment. What are they saying? What are they not? What have I heard elsewhere at the United Nations? And some of the things they say, for example, as simple as the NPT allows, you know, uranium enrichment for all parties, or the authority to satisfy is the International Atomic Energy Agency, not the United States or Israel. You're like, yeah, that's sort of, I mean, if you say you defend the rules-based order, these are the rules, more or less speaking. So there's this unresolved issue, and I think it's been complicated by the actions that are moving us away from diplomacy. And this, the Arab states and others, the NAM, are not letting it go. So this is an issue that comes back time after another, the pursuit of a zone free of nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction in the Middle East. And as I think everybody knows, beyond the concerns, legitimate, we don't want Iran to get the bomb, about the possibility of Iran diverting weapons diverting its nuclear energy program for military purposes. The one state that we do know in the region for a fact has ever had nuclear weapons is Israel, and so that's also something that needs to be resolved. Ukraine will come up, I think, and this relates, of course, to the very foundational question of the use of nuclear weapons, of the purpose of deterrence, and how it affects conflict. Now, I've never thought, I'm very concerned about the nuclear risk in Ukraine, and I think it's perhaps, if nuclear weapons are going to be used, that is perhaps the weakest point today, or it's most likely that they could be used. Not that it's imminent, and no, not alarming, but that would be the weakest point. And I've never fully agreed with the narrative, that Putin's reckless rhetoric, increased the risk, or that Putin's reckless rhetoric introduced a nuclear weapons element to the conflict. I think the rhetoric was reckless, but the nuclear weapons element was part of the conflict, was going to be part of the conflict, whether or not he said anything at all. It's by their very existence that they introduce nuclear risk to the conflict. And what's going to increase or decrease the likelihood of nuclear weapons being used is not how forceful the words of Putin or Medvedev or anyone else are, but the conditions on the ground. The conditions on the ground. That's what drives risk. And I think a lot of these alarmists or hype sort of oriented analysis that say, oh, he said this and they said this. It doesn't matter. I mean, it's the conditions on the ground and how close, intentionally or inadvertently, you get to what a nuclear armed state considers its vital interest. And that threshold puts you in risky territory. It doesn't matter if it's Russia. It happens to be Russia now, where that might do that. But the logic of deterrence, the nuclear use doctrine is actually quite similar across nuclear armed states. And in general, if you cross a certain undefined threshold of vital national interest, that's when the risk really gets exacerbated. So it's the presence of nuclear weapons more than the words. Just two more to wrap up. So the chatter about I said earlier, we might be closer to one more than to one fewer nuclear weapon state. There are proliferation pressures still to this day. I mean, and even though there's a norm, supposedly there's a norm, against acquiring nuclear weapons, we must remember we started the nuclear era with 5 nuclear armed states, and now we have 9. I mean, proliferation that's happened. And we've heard now in times of security uncertainty, of perceptions of vulnerability, we've heard speak of the Eurobomb, for example. We've heard speak of small modular reactors, which may be a concern from a proliferation perspective. So proliferation pressures have not gone away. What we cannot accept is any narrative that says that the primary risk of the nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation regime is the risk of proliferation. Of course, it has to be contained, and of course, it has to be addressed, but proliferation is a byproduct of nuclear weapons. Proliferation is a byproduct of the existence of nuclear weapons. So the primary problem always is the states that actually have nuclear weapons and not the pressures that those nuclear weapons generate, important as they are. And the last issue that will likely come up in the next NPT conference is the long-standing unresolved tension, for lack of a better word, between the NPT and the TPNW, the NPT from 1970 and the TPNW from 2017. These are, I won't go into the details, time does not allow, the difference between these two treaties, but these are two frameworks, both ostensibly pushing for the pursuit of a world free of nuclear weapons, and I think arguments about the incompatibility between the two simply do not hold water. In fact, the NPT is an effort, a rare effort of actual concrete implementation of the NPT. Whether or not it succeeds, whether or not it actually leads us to the elimination of nuclear weapons, it is an effort in good faith by a number of parties to the NPT that are party now to the TPNW. So I think that dialogue rather than competition between these two will be instructive. I will leave it there, and we will see next year how these issues evolve at the review conference.
No, thanks, Cesar. And I'm glad you pointed out that the U.S. nuclear modernization is not something simply to be attributed to the Trump administrations, either the first or the second. In fact, it goes back further than Biden. It was Barack Obama who first endorsed, multi-billion-dollar modernization of U.S. nuclear forces. Albeit, he did it in part as a pact with the devil in order to get the Senate to ratify the 2010 New START treaty, which capped the size of strategic resources, but forces. But all the same, it's a long pedigree in terms of presidential support for that.
lost New Start and kept the modernist.
That's what it appears to be, yeah. Though it takes two for tango on that. Yeah, and Matt, your reference to rational leaders reminds me of a saying attributed to Bertrand Russell, which was, I've been told that man is a rational being. I've spent my entire career searching for evidence to support this. So I think the scene has been well set. Maybe the colors are a bit dark and doomful, but that shouldn't deter us in terms of looking for paths of progress. So I invite any questions from the audience. I see David over here, and then Karine. Okay, I'll take David first.
A couple of scenarios for you, Venezuela and Ukraine. Give us the perspective of the American calculation and the Russian calculation with respect to the deployment of nuclear-tipped missiles, either being carried by a Tupolev bomber or coming in through some hypersonic missile capability. So far we've heard in the Russian-Ukraine context that the Americans have made a very adroit calculation that no matter how hard they push Russia, they will never resort to using nuclear weapons. It doesn't have to. It has alternatives such as hypersonic. I'd like to get your sense of whether there's any strategic calculation at play here, or is this just gamesmanship, brinksmanship, both from the Russian and the American perspective. With respect to Venezuela, we know that the last time Trump was in power, threatening to invade with John Bolton at the helm, that Russia sent its Tupolev bombers, possibly nuclear-tipped, as a sign of a warning of some sort. We haven't seen any kind of signal from Russia this time around. Can you give us a sense again of whether the U.S. is flagrantly playing with the rules of the game with respect to engaging Russia, disregarding the fact that it is also a nuclear-powered country, nuclear-capable country, or that there is some larger strategic game at play here, and America understands fully that Russia's not really capable of or willing to target the U.S. or its allies with nuclear missiles.
Okay, do you both want to have a comment? Cesar, why don't you lead off?
Sure. Thank you for those highly complex questions. So on Ukraine, sometimes we hear this notion of this question whether whether Putin might be bluffing. You know, oh, no, we can go further. We can go further. We can provide more military equipment because Putin might be bluffing. And I'm always confounded by that question because I'm like, it's neither a bluff nor a non-bluff. It's like it's conditions of the ground, like on the ground. It's conditions on the ground. I don't believe Russia will take a decisive military defeat while having a nuclear arsenal. I personally don't believe that. I think, you know, nuclear weapons will be used before that happens. The thing is, we don't know exactly what that threshold is. So once you start sort of getting into their vital security interests of the Russian Federation or the vital security interests of any nuclear armed states, including the United States, who would never accept the inverse situation that Russia is in right now, then you get into risky territory. Kyiv is not Washington, and it's not London, and it's not Brussels. So I think Putin could make a calculus whereby he can get away with a lot, attacking Ukraine, attacking Kyiv, attacking Ukrainian positions, but being cautious enough not to attack, you know, the territory of NATO. What I bet, and one last comment. To this day, I'm very, you know, more than 3 years into the war, with all the life and treasure that's being poured into it and the concomitant nuclear risk, I still don't know what the end game is. Like from the perspective of the West, from the perspective of the provision of military support. Like, I'm not just saying this for effect. I have no idea what the end game is. And you would think that for such an investment of treasure and blood and lives lost, etc., there will be some idea of where this is going. But we do know that there will be no decisive military victory over Russia. So where does that leave us? So.
Just just really not much more to add. I would suggest that I think something that's become very evident over the past few years of this war is that Putin likes to sort of reflect what he interprets as NATO belligerency back to NATO. And so, for example, for many years, Putin criticized the United States' deployment of nuclear weapons to Europe as in contravention of the NPT, all of these different things. We can agree or disagree as to whether or not he's correct. But then he basically just decided, hey, you know what? If I don't want to do the moral high ground thing anymore, I'll do it too, right? And so I'll just deploy nuclear weapons to Belarus, and therefore, we'll essentially be mirrored to each other. I think the flights to Venezuela are similar, right? I think he sees NATO conducting, bomber runs, Steadfast Noon, all of these different exercises where there's NATO planes flying close to the Russian border, and Russia does that all the time as well, right, to the U.S. side of things. But I think it's kind of a similar thing where it's just like, okay, we do the same thing back. Not a like moral or value judgment in any way, I think what he seems to like to do is to do this like mirroring effect of what he sees as belligerence on the part of NATO, right? I don't say that to like apologize for it, but I think just to try and interpret what's happening here.
Thanks. Kareem, we're here, I think.
Yes,
Next.
thank you. So I enjoyed listening to both the panelists. It's wonderful. And what I have is more of a comment, less of a question.
Keep it short, though.
Oh, yes, it's very short. So I'd love to get the focus closer home to the nuclearization of the Arctic. It's a well-known fact. The Arctic caps are melting at 4 times the usual rate. The nuclearization in terms of nuclear submarines and the other prototypes which go with it, all of it is rising exponentially. Now that was the bad news. But then I draw on what Sylvie said. We all have a duty of hope. So in that duty of hope, there is hope in the Golden Dome. We'll have this conversation much longer. We're looking at sensors, and that is where Canada has a huge opportunity. We have ESRI, we have the ground-based capabilities. We have the kind of sensors which have the ability to detect nuclear leaks, wastes, radioactive material. If that is part of these kind of domes, we have the kind of diplomatic initiative, the governance mechanism, which actually brings a practical solution. We're not looking at a full global picture or a dome which encloses the entire world. We're looking at a part which is contextually very important to us and wherein we have the solutions. Perhaps we can take the conversation further, speak on that. There would be pitfalls, a variety of issues, but we can move ahead on that. Thank you.
Thanks, Kareem. Maybe no immediate response, but let's take another, is it Ernest? Please.
Thank you very much, Chair. Dominique Galpin, Foreign Affairs. Thank you very much to the panelists. Appreciate the very much here. I'd like to pick your brain on something that I've been wondering for a while. Is as the international community has been able to ban some forms of weapon, but we stick to nuclear weapon. Like, what is so special about them? Nobody's talking publicly about modernizing their chemical or bio assets, right? They might be doing secretly, but they're not bragging about modernizing them. What is so special about nuclear weapon that people stick to them and we're just not able to put them on the same list that we did with? Everybody understood that chemical or biological weapon also had a strong deterrence effect, but we were able to put them aside. What is it in your experience that makes it so difficult to have the same mindset when it comes to nuclear weapons? Thank you.
Okay, thanks. I think we're just giving the time, just collect the remaining questions, and then I'll have our panelists respond to the ones that they wish to. Erica.
I'd just like to ask a quick question of Matt. You showed the FAS graph, and China's nuclear weapons have gone up to 600. Could you speak about how you found out about that, about their launching time, which is shortening, and maybe the implications for great power stability, but of course keeping it? Thank you, Matt.
Thanks. And Michael, did you have a question? You're just leaning on the rail. Any more? Okay.
Hi, my name's Hanny. I was wondering for Matt, if you could talk about the guardrails that you'd like us to see for exporting small modular reactors. You probably heard that Atkins is trying to export the CANDU to more countries. So I'm wondering what guardrails you would like to see from a non-proliferation perspective on those exports.
Okay, thanks. Matt, maybe you can field a couple of those, I think. Start with whichever you felt best.
Okay, these are great questions. Thank you. I'm unfortunately going to punt the question on small modular reactors because I will say it's outside of my own scope of study, and I don't want to go too deep. But if Cesar has some thoughts on that, I welcome it. In terms of what makes nuclear weapons so special, it's a really good question. I have a couple thoughts. I'll focus on one in particular, and I sort of alluded to it earlier, but when it comes to the timelines of how long it takes for these weapons to get built, or researched, developed, built, deployed, and then maintained, we're talking like 40, 50, 60 years. And I've spent a lot of time over the past few years looking at the United States' next generation of intercontinental ballistic missiles in particular, right? This is the missiles that are in the ground right now are 50 plus years old. They're going to be building a new system that's going to be also in the ground for the next 50 years or so. That one has not even been deployed yet, and there are already people in the United States talking about what the next system is going to look like, right? And thinking about research and development on that already. It's so difficult, I think, to just jump off that train and think about disarmament when you're so deep into the procurement process. I think, like, at the very least, from a military and defense planning standpoint, the way that things will typically happen, I guess, is that, a system is examined very much in its own silo, right? Pun somewhat intended. And they notice it's getting old, and they say, okay, well, then we need a replacement. And it just happens through inertia forever, right? There's no strategic thinking about if that system is actually required anymore, if it fits into a national defense strategy that makes sense, if we take it in combination with all of these other systems and say, oh, okay, we have submarines, do we need ICBMs anymore? Like, there's none of that, right? It's just system getting old, build new system indefinitely. And I found that to be quite a challenging thing to reckon with. I don't think it makes nuclear weapons super special relative to other types of weapons, but it's something that has been on my mind for a while as I sort of think about disarmament and the pathways to sort of break off of that. So that's just one very, very tiny factor in what is, I think, a really important question that encompasses a lot of other things. To the question about China's increase, right, just to go a little bit more detail on this, right, this is something that is a tremendous change for China, right? Before 2020, 2021 or so, China had maybe a few hundred nuclear weapons. They were very content with this policy of what I think folks in the West sort of called minimum deterrence, what China would call having the fewest number of nuclear weapons needed for their national security, right? I think from China's perspective, I don't think that they've made a tremendous doctrinal change, but what I think they've calculated is that they've looked around the world and they've said the United States and other countries have a tremendous amount of conventional superiority. They have nuclear weapons and conventional weapons that can attack hardened silos deep into our country. They have tremendous capabilities in ISR, right? So intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, that sort of thing. And they've determined that the number of nuclear weapons needed for their security is now no longer 200 or 300. It's something more like 1,000, right? And that's kind of where they're going. Where we've been able to dive in more deeply and find out exactly what it is that they're doing is that we're using satellite imagery to track this stuff on basically a daily basis. And so if folks want to come find me during the break, I have all sorts of great imagery of this. Like this is part of the work that we do every day, which is going in and being able to track literally on a day-to-day basis construction that's happening at silo fields in the middle of China, right? And being able to look using thermal imagery, synthetic aperture radar, all these different types of things. It's a lot of fun. It's really interesting. But what it sort of reveals is that countries are moving really quickly, right? When it comes to nuclear modernization, like things get built. Like I talked about long timelines, but like it never stops, right? It's always happening, and it's going to happen in the United States too.
Cesar?
Just briefly on that provocative question, an excellent question about what makes nuclear weapons special and like why nukes and not other categories of weapons. And I appreciate the question. It's sort of philosophical, strategic in a way. So, and there are strategic reasons why it's different from other weapons. But I would say in short, and not because it's a well thought out answer, but just I think it's because it's the top weapon in destructiveness. I mean, that alone, if there is any sort of hierarchy, ranking, however you want to structure of weapons, and there's one at the top, there are those who will want it, because it's the top. It's the most destructive, so you want to have it. Also, there are people, even though I firmly and with conviction believe that they bring more instability, there are people who actually believe in the benefits of nuclear weapons, and people believe that they actually hold the peace, and we believe otherwise. We think the evidence points in a different direction, but I believe that there are some people who believe in the benefits that are afforded by nuclear weapons. A third reason, to make up for conventional disparities, and I think that is a very, very, very central one that may become increasingly relevant now that everyone's talking about building up their conventional military capabilities. I think yesterday we mentioned the example of India and Pakistan, whereby India is unquestionably superior when it comes to conventional military capabilities than Pakistan. But Pakistan can consider itself to be a rough equal to India now because it's on a different level in terms of the nuclear question. So that alone is going to make them attractive. Just wanting to have the top most stabilizing weapon. I wonder. And just to wrap up, I wonder about the impact of AI and new technologies going forward, especially the impact that we cannot think about right now. There may be some things to say about the impact that we can think about and some of the foreseeability of the implications for good and bad of new tech and in particular AI. But in the category of things we don't know and it's just hard to foresee, I wonder if it will be a perpetual truth that nuclear weapons are the top source of strategic leverage. I wonder if there may be something else soon or later, enabled by AI, by strategic intelligence, that changes the calculus. Something else that rises to that level. Now there's another tool for strategic leverage that may make the attractiveness of nuclear weapons lessen, or AI increases the mutual vulnerabilities to such an extent that just like it's space debris, it's in everybody's interest, to such an extent that it's really in the collective interest not to have them because the downside is so obvious. But yeah.
Just one last point, just to pick up on this idea that countries can sort of erode the deficiencies between them by one country developing nuclear weapons. Just anecdotally, I wonder if folks here had similar conversations. But over the past several months, in particular, around March or so of this year, I had a lot of family and friends asking me, "Do you think Trump would be saying the things that he's saying about Canada if Canada had nukes?" And I honest answer, probably not. Right, and that just shows like nuclear weapons can define relationships between countries in different ways. I don't think Canada should get nuclear weapons, but like it's interesting that just anecdotally those were conversations that we were having.
Right. Do you think Maduro wishes he had them?
Yes. And let me just try to respond to the gentleman with a question about small modular reactors. I think the one-word answer, proliferation. I mean, we now have maybe X number of reactors globally, each that have a source of fissile material, the essential ingredient to make a nuclear weapon. And when we talk, or visions, because there's still visions of, let's say, 5X reactors through the deployment of small modular reactors, you have a 5-fold increase in your proliferation risk. So that, I think, is the nutshell of our concerns. We've now come to 3 o'clock. I would just ask you to join me in thanking our 2 great speakers.